last time, but recording in progress.
Yay.
Last time, but oh, oh, that was not me. Okay.
Okay, cool. Kyle, you said you had a little bit of a read on what we're reading. So I'm going to let you lead off this time. I'm feeling somewhat under the weather, but I'm still here. So we'll get into some of this good stuff. So everyone joining us, we're still pondering the end of quality, not quite the beginning of quantity, and there's a lot to go over in that. We'll probably be on it for a few more weeks because there's stuff to talk about with Kant, stuff to talk about with atomism, and a couple of those other things, and just what repulsion and attraction are supposed to be and look like. Because if you think about the one and the many and the one's acts of repulsion and then attraction and how this coalesces into quantity, the one being given a quantitative dimension, you could say, are pretty easy to think about in retrospect if you read the summaries. But as far as tracking the logic of their mechanism as they unfold, it's a bit of a different story. So take it away, Kyle.
One thing I think I was struck before I go into it was this kind of thinking about the qualitative repulsion and attraction, which, is just a relationship between. It kind of reminds me about how, like, kind of going up and down, kind of like how what things are made of. So in the sense, like, yeah, if you were for repulsion, it's kind of realizing as you go down from a person down, you go to like atoms and other matters. That's kind of the repulsion into different components. But at the same time, if you go the reverse direction, that's attraction.
Yeah.
So that really helped me kind of more understand this qualitatively, because I'm still thinking about it like matter. So, um,
And as it turns out, matter and its behavior is exactly where these qualities, these determinate qualities of being, are are externally. How would Hegel say it? Are externally manifested, and how you talk about them has to be complete, which is why an imminent renovation of the categories is so helpful, because you don't need to necessarily be just a total materialist, even talking about the physics of it, but also be conscious about how we construct it in our heads, how we talk about it in our thoughts, and put it down on the page is as equally important as to what shows up in the microscope or in the telescope. Uh, Go ahead, Kyle.
yeah, I was trying to kind of review kind of where I was at with uh repulsion because it's interesting in the end kind of think about because it starts off as because the one itself is supposed to be it's self-referential. If you think about that in the negative context, which from the still again interesting. I kind of like to know right quick where we end up going with the bouncing back between being and it's kind of a negation aspect of it, and where that ends up in quantity. But so right here, in a way, it is a negation in a sense because it is a negative edge, as Holgate puts it, to self-referential. So it's the exclusion of the one. And of course, I'm trying to remember, have we gone through this part already, or are we just re-reviewing?
We're um
Or you can't, because I stopped at the exclusion of the one.
yeah, as far as our reading goes, we went right up to the end of quality.
Yeah.
So in our reading, we've already gotten there at least a week, maybe 2 weeks ago. But
Yeah.
as far as understanding what's going on, so that we can um, anticipate what's coming up in the next parts. I really feel like being able to understand the all of the ins and outs are going to help with that. Um, because when you get into quantity, quantity is the state in which quality is the state that's indifferent to quality. Okay, meaning that it can be apples, it could be oranges, right? The quantity of those stays the same, right? It's indifferent to whatever qualitative being is being counted, for instance, and that's an application. But at the same time, to be a quantity, and especially a developed quantity, um, it's okay in its immediate initial state. Quantity is not only indifferent to quality itself, but it also contains all the determinations of quality. Because it's so immediate, it's almost like quality goes like this, and then it goes back down into quantity. And as quantity, at least immediate quantity, it's a very flat, abstract term to begin with before its being is unfolded, and then it's determinate being, and then it's being for self. And if this sounds familiar, that's exactly where we're headed with this. That triad is repeated throughout being. I can't remember what happens in essence, um, whether they multiply again or what. I forget. Um, I'm sure we'll get there at some point.
So I was, yeah, that's the thing I was thinking about on repulsion. Sorry, because it's kind of a replication in the end that it's by pushing itself out creates a one, which kind of creates itself. So you have a bunch of many ones, but these many ones are themselves just trying to think. Okay, that's because right, because they were simple ones, and in a way, it's trying to think of it kind of creates its own other in here, but they're all both, you know, only connected in that they are exclusions of each other. But that's still a negative relationship. So,
Yeah.
right.
I'm just going to read this out because I think it might help a little bit. This is from the Holgate. He says Hegel describes the one as a becoming of Werden. It is a becoming or process for two reasons. First, the one is the becoming of many ones, that is, the moment, a movement of repulsion. Second, it is the process of relating to itself in those many ones and becoming one self relating one, that is, the movement of attraction. One could say that through the course of its logical development, the one is the process of becoming repulsion and attraction themselves. Um,
What page?
now, yeah, go ahead.
What page was that? Sorry.
It is page 289
Ah,
in Holgate's volume one of his new book.
almost got there. Yeah.
And that's actually quite helpful to sort of relate it to becoming. Um,
The becoming, yeah. What was that? I was,
you're fine. Take your time. We've
yeah,
got all the time in the world with this.
because,
Um,
yeah.
Now ask me whether I understand the ins and outs of repulsion and attraction, and
Oh,
yeah, I'm not quite there yet, which is why we're tarrying on this.
right.
Uh, and then he goes in. He says, now as the finite and bad infinite come to be the process of relating to themselves through one another, they also come to be moments of that process. The same is true of the one. It too becomes a moment of the process or processes that it proves to be precisely as a self-subsistent one. A moment, we recall, is what is no longer just itself, that is, what has been negated or sublated. Accordingly, Hegel says of the one that the process which it is posits and contains it from all sides only as something sublated. So it's not just the moment by itself, but it's the moment within the newly sublated category,
Right. That's what I was
or unity, I should say.
trying to get back to, because there's, where was I read it earlier, where the fact that when the bunch of moments themselves, or sorry, the many themselves, through their attraction, or was it moments, or themselves moments of a one of attraction. And so in that way, that's kind of the, some ones together creates a new whole, okay, or another one. And there's, I don't remember where he was going into that, where that uh it's not just that they are moments, but they are not themselves lost in the sublation. They still remain ones even in sublation, even through that process.
Right, but it's never just one, it's many ones.
Right. And so
and and
it's kind of a sublation where that identity is not negated out. It remains. I think that's
right.
what he brings out there. So that's, I almost feel like that's just getting that's maybe the new thing we'll be seeing in quantity at that deeper level.
Yeah, I'm paging down a little bit, and so
Oh yeah, there's a section where he does kind of, remember the whole thing where he characterizes things as accents on the same term,
yeah, yeah.
where traction is ones in relation, while repulsion is rather the ones in relation.
Huh.
So yeah,
Yeah,
so the
yeah, that makes
ones,
sense.
yeah, the ones exist because they are the kind of exclusion that creates the many, and then the attraction is the relation between the ones.
Yeah,
Right.
plural. Yeah, the pluralization.
Then the part that kind of got me a little bit that I'm kind of going through is that not only, I mean, it's kind of obvious you can say repulsion, obviously, attraction presupposes repulsion because that's how it's generated initially. But attraction also repulsion also presupposes attraction, and
Yeah.
they both presuppose themselves
It,
in
it's
some
in,
way.
it's interesting how that works because when we get into essence, like every single category is like that. Every single
Mhm.
antinomy, using Kant's word, is actually coextensive and not an actual opposite. Um, and when you think of one, you have to think of the other. Whereas in being, attraction and repulsion are states in which the other disappears. Like something disappears and there's the other, but then you find out it's also something, and so that other disappears from your abstract point of view, or however the category is articulated. Yeah, something like that. Um, Difference is accented in
Right.
being quite a bit.
Attraction is the
Mostly at the determinant being level.
right. Attraction is thus the posited ideality of the ones. They're explicit, not just being separate from one another. That's
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, I think that's what I was saying earlier.
Here we go. So it's near the end, but he says quantity is the sphere in which there is no clear qualitative difference, determinacy or limit, because repulsion and attraction are moments of one another, and for that very reason continue themselves in their other, and because the one also continues itself in other ones. It is also the sphere in which there is no pure self relation or being for self, because neither repulsion nor attraction is just itself by itself.
Right.
The one continues being itself only outside and beyond itself. In other words, externally. Like you could abstract it, but that would be the only way you could like look at it in that way. Quantity is thus characterized above all as the absence of simple quality itself or thisness. It is the sphere in which nothing is just itself. I'm not sure what that last statement means, but um, okay. Quantity is thus made necessary by the quality of the one, which in turn give rise to repulsion and attraction, and so ultimately by quality as a whole. Yet quality is no longer quality as such, but quality that has been negated or sublated. Quality, as we have seen, consists in being determinate, being this, not that, and further in being self-relating, in the form of something and then of being for self. These two forms or aspects of quality are subtly different, but they also have something important in common. They're both forms of what one might call itselfness. Whatever is determinate is a moment of its difference from another. So there it is. And so is not simply freestanding, but is also different from that other. And so, in that sense, is itself. To be self relating, on the other hand, is to be explicitly oneself and to stand apart from any other. In both cases, therefore, quality consists in being oneself, what one is. And then he goes into the difference between quality and quantity. And so he's describing in a nutshell how some of this logical articulation works, and it's all very abstract, and it all really just applies to how you describe how one would best describe these states of being of anything, whether you're an astronaut or an asteroid. You can describe those things uh, in this manner. And when you do, right, there are certain ways, if you follow Hegel, to be able to logically expound on not only how how an astronaut is an astronaut and not an asteroid, but also how the astronaut is not just determinate, but for itself. In other words, consistently continuing as a state of being and relating to other things that are consistently subsisting, um, and remaining that through, whatever medium they're in, space, time, etc. One of the things I really appreciate about Hegel's side commentary throughout is that he tells you in the logical story of these categories, you cannot deviate from the logical line from sheer being through spirit, right? You can't read anything in, but when you're talking about these different categories and how they relate to each other, you can feel free to find as many examples as you like. And he gives you some, and he says, have at it in applying these states of being to real external things in the real world, because that's what's going to make your descriptions of whatever's out there, whether it's a coffee cup or a computer monitor, that much richer, right? You're going to have that bigger level of complexity. You're going to take less for granted. So when he goes into his theories on the state in philosophy of right, and he talks about property, he's not just talking about property immediately, but also property is the determinate being of property, let's put it that way, as well as property for itself, right? And getting, pushing into Marx, you can appreciate how you could look at, say, a piece of property or a commodity by itself, as well as the fact that it's real, um, determinate, I should say, as well as what it looks like when it's fully for itself. It and how it even though it changes its shape across the capital circuit, it still retains the essence, the being of a commodity. It has a use value, it has an exchange value, right? And it's born in a process, and depending on where it is in the circuit, you can not so much guess as track where it's going to go next, right? Like it just left the production process. Where's it going? It's going into a storage warehouse where it awaits to be shipped to distributors, to be put in front of consumers who pick it up and then pull it into a different circuit of capital, basically consumption, where it leaves the capital circuit and goes into the consumption circuit. But it doesn't leave the capital circuit necessarily, because it sustains, if it's like an edible product, it would sustain someone who participates in the capital circuit and thereby feedback, the reproduction cycle, the full reproduction cycle of all of these things, in which actually very little is lost. If you think about it, I mean, waste products being, of course, what they are, but one couldn't say that a consumption product, you just have to treat it like a waste product where capital is concerned, because that wouldn't work, yeah, if it sustains the labor of the day-to-day labor of a laborer or many laborers, in an industry and so forth. There's an economy there. It's a, I don't want to say complicated, but it's a uh, sophisticated economy that's not just flat one thing, one linear line. It's many lines on maybe a flow chart, or I don't know how you would map that out. I think David Harvey used like a flow chart to try to map all the different lines in the circuits. I don't know how well a job he did, but he made an attempt. That probably got a little away from the text. Maybe not. Probably not.
Hmm.
I I am just I before you got here, Doug, we were talking about, well, I was talking to Kyle about Kyle missed Alex's last meeting, but Alex Steinberg's last Hegel class this last Saturday. He went into quantity and quantum, and all the way up to measure, and he did so by just reading the Encyclopedia Logic. Quantity and quantum are far too large a chapter for, um, uh, well, actually, he might get into that in the fall, or not in the fall, but in the spring, like February. Sorry, what am I trying to say? Um, Kyle and I were talking about how it's ironic that so many people in the early 20th century were concerned with the crisis of physics and science in general. And um, this subject is extensively covered by Hegel in the quantum and quantity section, and I think in measure, because it was already happening in his day. Philosophy, if you remember from the introduction, he says, has been totally um, discredited in Hegel's own era, because Kant's critique wasn't enough to renovate the categories. And before that, I mean, it was just like schoolboy logic and metaphysics that didn't really connect with anything modern, right? And the effect on scientific study was that instead of being able to scientifically, um, what's the word, organize necessity philosophically, all you have is Hume's empiricism and, past tradition on how science is done, and that's it, right? There's nothing to order the necessity angle, which is why Hegel's attempt, especially in the philosophy of nature, but also in these sections on quantity and quantum, he tries to renovate the philosophical organization of necessity in order that one could more scientifically organize science, I guess you could say. In other words, there's the content, there's the data, but how do you organize it? How do you account for the leaps from quantity to quality, for instance, that Thomas Kuhn talks about in his book, in which he gives no credit to Hegel, by the way, or Marx. I find that highly suspect. But he's
Thomas Kuhn
talking.
doesn't give much credit to anyone.
Oh, I know. It was all his
A lot of
idea.
people who
But
he
anyone who's read this stuff,
doesn't give him credit.
yeah. Oh, I know. But even Christopher Caldwell, it's extreme. To me, it's the height of irony that in the Crisis of Physics book he wrote, he basically dismisses Hegel as an idealist who's useless past his sort of mystical dialectic, and that's it. And Marx gave us a better bead when Hegel has this entire section on exactly what he's talking about in his own book, in this, in the section to come on quantity and measure. It boggles my mind. It's all right there, right? He's yeah.
Well, Soviet debates in the 1920s, you had the mechanistic school, which was mostly natural scientists and some
Versus the
engineers.
dialecticians, yeah.
They were the mechanists were very anti-Hegel.
Yeah, and
They basically said, their view of Marx was somebody who completely superseded Hegel. And their reading of Marx was, yeah.
well, yeah, half of them read Marx as if he was Feuerbach.
Yeah.
Like they completely missed the fact that Marx, even if he had a few published comments on, most of his published comments on Hegel attacked the German idealists, not Hegel himself. Hegel was the lodestar against which they judged every one of the both. Well, I say Marx and Engels because both of them did this. Both of them judged the German idealists against Hegel's own model, which they honored throughout. It is a sort of skeleton key. You look at one of these German idealists, you stick in the skeleton key and you say, oh yeah, they tried to use Hegel in this flat materialist or idealist context, and it was highly inappropriate to do that, and that was most of the basis of their criticism. You, you know, um, anyway, one I think one of the advantages, even if you completely dismiss Hegel, in reading Marx, because Marx follows Hegel as well, to a great degree. I don't know how well a degree, but in following Marx, you're following Hegel. Even if you don't know it, even if you completely dismiss Hegel, you're still following Marx's reading of Hegel, which is mostly just Hegel. So that's an advantage. So even if you completely, I like to say, even if you've completely dismissed Hegel, if you follow Marx and you read him, not like the mechanists, at least, you're at least carrying most of the weight you should. Whether you understand it all, that's the open question. And if you go back and read Hegel, you find out how much of a closed question it is. Anyway. I know we've all talked about this at various junctures in other classes. I'm sort of just recapitulating a little bit for the YouTube audience of maybe one or two people who are watching us at this point. But yeah, it's good to talk about, at least for the archive. As far as our readings go, I don't know. I need to catch up myself and get better at this section. But I almost wonder if it'd be worth it just to put a pen in it and keep going, or if we need to spend more time. Um, I don't know about anyone else, but I've got family stuff going on in 2 weeks, so the 25th is definitely out. The
Yeah.
first, actually, okay, let's put it this way. Next Monday we will meet, but the next 2 weeks are the 25th and the 1st, which I mean, uh, I've got family stuff going on both. So why don't we meet? I mean, next week, obviously, but then take 2 weeks off and meet on the 8th. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah.
And what I propose then is that next time we continue talk, I mean, I'll read some more and have some more stuff to talk about, definitely for next week. But then we can take the 2 weeks and maybe close out our reading, and then on the 8th, we on the 8th when we meet, we can finish talking about quality and start into quantity, at least like immediate quantity. Can we set that up a little bit? Does everyone feel comfortable with that?
Yeah. Then we start next time, or are we talking about in January?
No, in like next time we talk about the Kant section maybe, and some of the other remarks, and sort of solidify our hold on repulsion and attraction, better than we have it now. And on the 8th, we close out quality and start in on immediate quantity. Um, and I'll say that next time. You guys don't have to write anything down. Um, and I'll in that 2 weeks I'll try to read the Hoolgate a little bit better. Um, I don't know that I don't know. There's a lot to this, and sound good, everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody listen to the whole gate the podcast.
I got about halfway through it, and it's wonderful, but it's definitely a lot more substantive, this podcast, than the last one that I shared months ago. Um, that one was sort of more like, just sort of a summary of what he was doing. The Xavier, what's his face, who does it for the podcast this time, really gets into the weeds, like the meat of being nothing, becoming something, and sort of grills Hoolgate a little bit on some of those things, and it's really great. But it's all you have to be paid. You couldn't just play it in your car and get every single snippet of it. You have to like be paying attention, undivided attention to really get everything. But he puts it in plain language, and you can really hear him worrying about whether or not he can get across some of the concepts that he's getting across to like a popular audience. Like he's still unsure about how well it comes across in a popular context, um, which is a great thing for a philosopher actually to worry about, especially someone who's trying to get across Kant or as Hoolgate calls him, Kant, and and Hegel. One of the things he talks about in the podcast that I've run across so far is his distinction between Hegel's Kant and Kant's Kant. And those are two different things. Okay. Hegel says things about Kant that if you actually go and read Kant, as Kant understands what he's doing himself, are at variance. And Hoolgate talks about that in his book. He talks about that especially in the podcast. And in drawing that distinction, it really uh, it it's it makes you realize that getting through philosophical material is very much uh, much more complicated than it appears. Um,
Is such a thing as creative misunderstanding of a thinker.
well, and also Hegel's I don't want to call them misreadings of Kant
Yeah.
so much as Hegel is answering questions to do with the era he lives in and the place he lives in. They just came out of the French Revolution. You know, Napoleon has already conquered Jena, right? And he's responding not only to Kant, but also Fichte and Jacobi. Um, and by the time of the Logic, he's actually friends with Jacobi to the point where he starts to sort of scotch a bit of his own criticism. And Woolgate talks about this in the podcast, but Hegel misread, also has a tendency to misread parts of Spinoza, such that he could, I suppose, be better on better terms with Jacobi than he was in the beginning, because he was totally at odds with him at Jena, and then later in Berlin, and especially well, in parts between, he became a better friend to him. Um, I, I don't know. Those are questions that go into, say, like Harrison's uh, doctoral thesis on Spinoza and um, Hegel's early period. Um, anyway, I'm just sort of stream of conscious seeing that, guys. So we've got about 20 minutes left. Is there anything in particular that you guys have questions on or issues with?
Other than finding time.
Yeah, finding time to sit down and read and really absorb this stuff. I don't know, for the last couple of weeks, it just hasn't come to me very easily to be able to sit down and walk through it. One thing I want to remind everybody on is if you just get totally lost and you're like, I don't know what the hell we're doing, remember you can go back to the Encyclopedia Logic, which we've already read, and you'd be surprised how short the sections are um, concerning this stuff. Quantity and quantum, especially, are like a few pages, compared to like at least 100 pages or so in the science of logic. And he touches on most of the issues in the EL, but he expands them greatly in the science of logic to be very specific about mathematics, especially in quantum. Um, so yeah, if you get lost or you don't know exactly how to put one thing with the other, he summarizes it all in the EL, which we've already read, and you can just look at those paragraphs and be like, okay, maybe this makes better sense looking at, either the, who do I want to say? Um, uh,
It's kind of like it's like a PDF, then he expands to the science of logic, and he expand further to Hogate.
the Wallace,
Yeah.
like if you go and look at the Wallace, he gives a pretty nice narrative relation of some of this stuff. If you want to go look at that, if you get lost, and yeah, I mean, over this next week, I'm just going to pull out the Wallace and try to puzzle out repulsion and attraction, the one and the many, with him, and see if he gives a little bit better of a. I say that, but it's like right in front of me, and so if I wanted to, I could just sort of. Is it here? Where is it? It's halfway through. It's uh, yeah, quantum is how much, and then there's pure quantity, quantity and quality, attraction and repulsion. Uh, but the many are one, but the many are one and the same as each other. This was badly edited. I'm wow. But the many are one and the same as another. Each is one, or even one of the many. They are consequently one and the same. Or when we study all that repulsion involves, we see that as a negative attitude of many ones to one another, it is just as essentially a connective reference of them to each other, and as those to which the one is related in its act of repulsion are ones, it is in them thrown into relation with itself. The repulsion, therefore, has an equal right to be called attraction. Equal right to be called attraction. Um, and the exclusive one, or being for self, suppresses itself, right?
Mhm.
Disappears basically within this doctrine. The qualitative character, which in the one or unit has reached the extreme point of its characterization, has thus passed over into determinateness, quality, suppressed into being as quantity. So basically, in the one and the many, you pass over from quality to quantity in the movement of repulsion and attraction, which um, basically are one and the same. This is why Houlgate notes that the one in Hegel's account is actually a version of becoming, right? In the one, quality becomes quantity. Does that make sense? And the mechanism for that is the coextensive motion of repulsion and then attraction. Like the inner quality of the one is externalized. Whoa, okay. The inner quality of the one is externalized from itself.
Yeah.
Into what? Into an external being
Which is the
or
void.
quality? Um,
Right. I guess that's kind of why the void kind of becomes another one, right? So,
yeah, yeah. The the void shows itself to be, yeah, another one. It's not just the one in the void. Um, ooh, okay. I think I understand that a little bit better, at least the shape of it, the mechanism, because if repulsion and attraction are the same coextensive movement, um, again, they sound like they're opposites, but they're not. They're coextensive,
yeah.
just like every other antinomy that Hegel tracks. And as a process, it has a result, which is quantity in the immediate.
Thinking about it, this kind of also relates back to making when repulsion and attraction develop their, spectrum, that kind of redefines the one and the many in a kind of new way. Because remember, like that's the thing where the many is a one of attraction, and of course, repulsion would be the reverse of many into one.
Yeah. And
Yeah, the movement. Right.
within the doctrine of being, the difference between the two is highlighted a lot more in that as you go from one to another, the other one disappears from your abstract consideration of them, I want to say. Um, and it's only in being for self where you have a full manifold of a category that the differences are contained, but they're unity of unity of opposites, basically the dialectical relation that the new category comes into focus, even in its most simple immediate state, like quantity immediately, is quite simple, but it also has all the other determinations, right? I think, yeah. Clear as mud.
Oh, it's thinner mud now.
Yeah. But I mean, if if you're looking for something concrete to sort of hang your hat on, especially in these early abstract categories that are hard to keep in your head, just keep in mind that as we go from category to category in the doctrine of being, at the end of the day, each of them, especially as they get more complicated, are going to have an immediate, a determinate, and a for itself shape in its development and unfolding, logical unfolding. And it's the logically unfolding shapes, I want to say, and how they're articulated again, it's a bad word, mechanically, but like, when you watch the becoming that the one is in its repulsion and attraction, um, you're seeing the logic move. You're seeing the category itself move. And later it'll turn out you're watching our minds move, considering what thought is and what it contains. Because that subject matter doesn't change throughout the logic. We're looking at thought and how it articulates itself in us. And we are the moving, we're the moving agent, but we can't treat ourselves like the moving agent. Um, how does Hoolgate say it in the podcast? He talks about presuppositionlessness, and he says, look, Hegel took his cue from Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. But what Hegel did was say, okay, that's great. That's a great way to do it. But take away the I. And so he takes away the I. He completely deletes it from the equation. And so instead of I think, therefore I am, he says thinking, therefore being. And that's how we start the logic, word for word, actually, to the point where it's just to the point where it's just a sentence fragment. Going back to being, he says, what does he say? Shit. I should have this memorized. It says being, pure being, without any further determination, period. And the rest of the paragraph is just him beating off um, any thought that it could be any more than that. And Hoolgate talks about that. Even though you could look at pure being as being immediate and indeterminate, you can't actually think of that pure being as in or undeterminate or unmediated or immediate, right? It's neither of those things, but it's also those things as far as description goes. Like he's trying to say this is as abstracted as you can get. There's nothing taken for granted, not Fichte's I, not Descartes' I, right? None of those things are proven yet. You cannot prove the I yet until you have accounted for what being turns out to be, and something turns out to be in quality, and so on and so forth, because the I has determinate qualities. It has it has qualities that are for itself, for that matter. And to start with where Descartes did and where Fichte did basically gave um, took a lot for granted, took less for granted, I think, than Kant. Because Kant basically reads out of Aristotle and tries to tries to organize it that way. Holgate gives Kant a lot of credit for being honest about his project. He says, I could define what all these things are, but I'm not going to. And he says that directly in the text. Kant says, I could do what Hegel eventually does, but I'm not going to do that. That will be for a future metaphysical tract, which of course he either never wrote or he only wrote in a, like a prologue. What's that word? Prolegema for a future metaphysics, something along those lines. Yeah. So there it is. I don't know. I find it fascinating that someone could do something like this at this level and give us a lot more to work with.
Also, I was trying to remember, was it Schopenhauer that he was mad at Hegel for removing the I as the starting point or something?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but Schopenhauer was one of these people who said it, without the I, what's the point, right? But he was more one of those will to power kind of guys,
okay.
as I'm sure Doug is slowly reading about. It's interesting that even Nietzsche, after his first period, swore off Schopenhauer as being too close to the masses, which is hilarious to read because his hatred for Hegel and Hegel's sort of democratizing reason was half the reason Schopenhauer was like, no, you can't do that.
I mean, Nietzsche is a radicalization of Schopenhauer, and his whole theory of the will.
Yeah.
Because the constant
You,
thread in Nietzsche is like, this defense of like elitism and aristocratic values. And he's looking for ways to do that.
you could almost
And
say
he puts his foot in various pools at times, like he looks to Voltaire, he looks to Schopenhauer. So
yeah.
Yeah, Schopenhauer was, for most of his adult life, he was an independent scholar, but eventually he got an appointment at the University of Berlin. And so when we started teaching, he decided to schedule his lectures at the same days and times as Hegel's lectures. But Hegel's lecture halls were always full.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer, if he got more than 2 or 3 students, he was having a good day. So that did not improve his disposition at all. Just made him madder at Hegel.
One of the things I find really pisses me off about Schopenhauer is apparently he outlived Hegel by quite a bit,
Yeah.
enough to where he was, I think, around during the 1848 revolutions, and was worked with, oh, who's that guy? Either worked with or was referenced by what's his name? I was just reading Lacerdo's account. Shit. Who wrote Democracy in America?
de Tocqueville.
Yeah, de Tocqueville and Schopenhauer were present for some of those events. And Hegel, of course, had died, a good 20 years before that, unfortunately. If Hegel had been around for the 1848 revolution, I think, well, it would have been interesting to see where Hegel was by that point. And of course, Marx was already participating in some of those events in Germany. So almost missed each other like that. It just kills me, right? Like if you had, I don't know, that would have been an interesting conversation to have.
Feuerbach was sitting around then, and
Yeah, but the one thing I've noticed about repulsion and attraction being coextensive as subcategories of becoming, or should I say being and nothing, right? Is that when you start to read, like I'm rereading parts of Lacerdo's book on liberalism. He calls it a counter history, taking his page off of de Tocqueville, and you see immediately in the first section how he maps out that what's called liberalism and what's called and what's basically usually thought of as uh, like tyranny, or how would I put it? I think it's Smith who said that he would rather have a tyranny that is smart enough to get rid of slavery than a liberalism that retains it, right? And that was part of the Scottish Enlightenment, I believe, especially one of his students, I forget his name right now, but Lacerdo mentions him and sort of maps out how coextensive, you know, uh, late Enlightenment notions of freedom and liberty are with the keeping of slaves, and how that it's interesting because the whole thing is coextensive, but it's flattened out in ways that are highly contradictory. And that's the point of Lacerdo's first chapter, is all of this looks contradictory. These people are vociferously the most, angry, the most vocal about protecting freedom from tyranny. And they're the slaveholders. And this is heavily remarked on. I know we're straying from Hegel, but actually we're not. Heavily remarked on by British loyalists, both in America at the time and in England itself. Like what are these guys going on about? They keep how many chattel humans, in slavery, and you can see the contradiction.
Yeah, Dr. Johnson made a famous quip about that. The men who claim to love liberty the most are the one are the worst slaves, beaters of slaves.
Yes, exactly. Like the worst offenders, actually.
Yeah.
And today, the way that bourgeois ideology has sort of flattened everything out. I mean, even the popular treatments. Like I've watched John Adams like 10 times. It's a great depiction. But at the same time, you see these sort of like asides where like this person or that person is like, oh, slavery is a sin and blah blah blah. I'm not sure that person would have actually said that at that time to George Washington, one of the premier slaveholders, right? Sort of like wringing the hands, on a TV movie, right? It's not at all historically accurate to what actually would have been said, I think. And I think if someone did a historically accurate depiction as far as what's written, it would be like a culture shock to any viewer today. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's the reason why people sort of flatten it out.
Yeah.
Makes for a good story, makes for great ideology to sort of put ourselves in the modern age in the best light, where even like the mistakes and I don't want to say mistakes, but contradictions of the past are sort of flattened out, glossed over, painted over as, oh, they're trying their best. When in reality, it's not a moral choice, it's a material one.
Yeah, I mean, historians have done studies of Jefferson as a slaveholder, and they basically found he was a pretty cruel master. He wasn't out of line with his class, but he wasn't any better than the others as far as treating slaves.
Right. And in modern American ideology, people tend to take his vociferously liberty-loving quotes, pull it out of context and turn it into a universal abstract devoid of its political context in the same way, and Doug, you're familiar with this, as Walter Kaufmann tried to do with Nietzsche and his philosophy. And you can see just how wrong-headed the entire enterprise is. Like, it turns it into something else entirely.
Is there any, like, even in that context, is there any sense of like continuity of anything, or does it feel like it's all chopped up at that point?
What do you mean?
Like, is it does what his abstraction from Nietzsche itself, does it even seem comprehensible at that point? It's kind of the question is, can you take that the fascist out of Nietzsche and still make any sense?
Oh, yes.
That's what they're trying to. That's what they've been trying to do since
I mean,
1950.
does it
Yeah.
still make sense?
Yeah, but the
But
problem.
no, it's like the ideas are still there. It's like it's not like hidden in like some unpublished piece. I'm talking like the published works. It's
Right.
all there.
I know.
Henry thus spoke to Zarathustra, which is probably his like most famous work. He calls socialist tarantulas. There's all kinds of stuff about, keeping the rabble down. It's all there. And, they try and sanitize it. But, and I'm not saying like everyone who reads Nietzsche is a fascist, but the ideas are still there. And, there's just been this constant effort to like sanitize him. Kaufman tried to make him like some liberal existentialist. A lot of the pomos have tried to make him like some kind of like founder of deconstructionism or whatever. But it also does a disservice to Nietzsche himself, who is inherently political. And I've been reading like the work his sister put out called The Will to Power, which is mostly composed in notes. And it certainly isn't a cohesive work like, Zarathustra. But I don't see any contradiction between what he says there and what he says in his published works. I mean, he's calling for like new slavery, for putting people down, like why, the Jewish revolt, slave revolt and everything. It's a conscious effort, and it does damage. And the Lacerda book, as long as it is, like it's actually wasn't long enough because he doesn't even deal with like a lot of the interpretations or Mussolini or stuff, and that's fine because he did his work.
The sort of cover Russian Marxists who were Nietzsche admirers.
Yeah, and they were, I think Ishay Landa put it best. There were people on the left, Adorno, and Sartre, Russian Marxists who've tried to appropriate Nietzsche, but it's not for them. Basically, it hampers emancipatory politics. It's a ball and chain. Whereas for the right, Nietzsche is Red Bull. It gives them wings, and it's to the full. You should try and be consistent with your philosophy, with your politics. Those people were not, and it hampered what they were trying to do. And there's things to like about Sartre. Drawing from Nietzsche or frickin' Heidegger is like not among them.
Yeah.
These ideas are not compatible. It's like trying to put what G.A. Cohen tried to do and all those analytical morons, and then trying to like make Marxism compatible with frickin' Austrian economics. These people were fascist supporters. There's policy support, unbridled capitalism and essentially keeping the working class down. Has nothing to do with Marxism. It's alien to it. It's incompatible with it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to go on a rant, but yeah, I really hate these ideas and I don't want them polluting Marxism.
Yeah, and it sounds like for the people reading Lacerda's Aristocratic Rebel, he's basically setting the research agenda for the next generation of folks who, I mean, actually read it and pay attention to it in the same way that Trotsky, with his 3-volume History of the Russian Revolution, set the agenda for researching that event. Because you can't research the Russian Revolution now without passing through Trotsky. And if you do, you end up missing so many people that he highlighted, even some of the reactionaries, especially the reactionaries who had decent takes on this aspect or that one, like Sukhanov, or, and I don't remember any of the other names, but he.
I mean, to be fair, Sukhanov is not actually a reactionary. He's
No,
just
no,
a
no, he's not.
social democrat,
Right.
which sucks, but it's a little different. But Nietzsche studies has to pass through Lacerda now, and to be completely fair, like Lacerda is essentially expanding on the Lukács chapter from Destruction of Reason.
Yeah.
And even pre-Lukács, if you go to Trotsky, if you go to, even Plekhanov, have like critical remarks on Nietzsche, they kind of had figured him out. And truthfully, if you actually look at some of the early Nietzsche interpreters in the US, people like H.L. Mencken wrote a book on Nietzsche, which I actually think gets a lot of his philosophy correct, because Mencken was an elitist reactionary.
And had no exactly, and had no need to hide it.
No. I mean, obviously, yeah, there have been, Emma Goldman tried to appropriate Nietzsche. It's not for the left. I mean, I'm going to sound sectarian. I don't want left Nietzscheans, left like that. It's not our philosophy. It's, you can be on the right if you want to do that crap. Go join Richard Spencer and his group. I think it should be rejected carte blanche.
Yeah.
There's nothing redeeming about it at all.
Man, I'm excited to see what you've come up with, Doug, with that, because like being able to like how should I put this? Being able to take one of the many sub prompts from Lacerda in his sort of renovation. I mean that's the next big project on the left, is purging the left of the last 100 years worth of reactionary eclecticism. I want to say.
I forget if it was I think it was Landon. He said, like, a lot of debates in academia, they don't realize like this isn't actually like left debates, the left academia.
Mm-hmm.
Like first of all, if you want to explore postmodernism or Nietzsche or Austrian economics or whatever it is, by all means, I think you should. And that's fine. I just don't think it has anything to do with Marxism or socialism. And, I think having philosophical clarity on this is important. It may not be the be all end all, but it's certainly part of what we need to do. And I do think getting rid of the eclecticism does matter, which, when I like, that's like why I'm trying to stick with Hegel as much as I like have difficulty following it, because the system here, it's like a necessary link in that chain of understanding like how the universe and reality functions, how thought functions. Nietzsche, I don't think provides that. And I don't think, that all these irrationalists, I don't think do. Like if you suddenly are embracing that, like what's the point? You may as well just, return to the church or something.
Yeah, you're returning to a kind of like subjectivism where the strongest come out on top, and it doesn't matter what the universe is actually it actually consists of, as long as you're able to assert your will. And that's a very, I mean, it basically says all of that stuff about reality, objective and subjective being coextensive, and the whole rest of it is just sort of like beside the point. Like you don't need to have that as long as you have a gun in your hand or an Air Force and so forth. Did we lose you, Doug?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that we've gone 13 minutes over, so that's fine anyway. Oh, hey, Doug. You're
Yeah.
back. But yeah, so we're 15 minutes past 10. If anyone has anything else from this reading that they want to talk about, we can do that, or we can sign off.
Oh, does the sort of cover say anything with the American pragmatists and Nietzsche?
Uh, well, he has his book on liberalism for one. He has the aristocratic rebel, and somewhere I think in there he probably covers the pragmatists in liberalism. He has.
Does
I
I
I
don't
think William
believe he
James himself,
does.
he has, I
you don't
think
think
William
so?
James himself said that he had affinities with Nietzsche.
I mean, he doesn't really even talk about Nietzsche's studies that much. For what I remember, I don't think he really talks about the American pragmatist. But let me just do a quick search. Yeah, he really does. And it's mostly about Nietzsche. Like he doesn't talk about Foucault or Deleuze all that much.
Who's the
And that's
big
okay.
American pragmatist? The guy in education. What's his name?
John Dewey.
Ah, okay. So,
William James was somebody who the Italians were discussing in the early 20th century. Gramsci talks about James in the prison notebooks, and Mussolini would quote James in his speeches.
okay. In the liberalism book, he doesn't talk about Dewey. It's not
No, I don't remember any reference to Dewey in the Aristocratic Rebel. I mean,
okay.
I think James would be might be more pertinent there. But I think because James thought James discerned some affinities between his thought and Nietzsche.
I don't remember any reference to James, honestly.
And there's no reference in the liberalism book either. Um, uh, Lacerda, at least in the liberalism book, is pretty targeted toward American and British sources to do with uh, well, I mean, liberalism and its contradictions and how it's coextensive with the domination and of what's the word Marx uses, the what do the capitalists do to the workers? They exploit them. Yeah. So how exploitation and the call for liberty are coextensive and, live in the same soil. And Landa, I think, extends that analysis, showing how fascism, well, in his Fascism in the Masses, he extends that analysis quite a bit. I haven't read that one yet. I've heard I need to really bad. Especially considering it might be the last thing Landa writes before he himself. I'm not going to say he's gone reactionary. I'm just going to say the genocide of Gaza has sort of swallowed up that section of the world, and everybody there is sort of in lockdown mode. It's man, it is. I've been talking to Ben a little bit, and I'm actually friends um, with Melamed, what's his face, who writes on Spinoza and has quite a few interesting things to say about Spinoza. But as far as the current situation, he is an Israeli through and through, unfortunately, Israeli nationalist, which I'm not sure if that's very compatible with,
No, it's not.
yeah, this guy, um, which is extremely unfortunate. But I think everything about that situation is extremely unfortunate. So don't get me started. I will get very angry. But then again, that's appropriate. So, okay. Unless anybody has anything else, I'll bid you all adieu. And I'll see you next week, and after that, we'll take 2 weeks off, and on the 8th, we'll finish up and start with quantity, and hopefully have a pretty tightly understood conception of quality. Yes. All right. Have a good night, comrades.
You too.